first of all, I'll just start with a quick overview of how I've kind of like broken down the workshop and what you guys expect from the workshop. We'll start with a bit of a theory, just talking about what or at least how I break down my references, as well as coming up with a work plan and how I developed my workflow as far as creating debris and destruction and blending it all together. And then afterwards, I'll kind of like go over my workflow of how I created the various kits that I used to create the debris, blend it all together, and it's just a couple of questions about benefits or geometry versus textures and when to use either. And later on we'll kind of like wrap up with a bit of a demo, going to the temple scene, and I'll kind of go over all the kits and how I've used them, and also briefly go over a topic that I thought was also important, is also using foliage to blend in debris. And later on just also go over a second diorama that I put together to showcase how texture blending is also used to blend in debris, and kind of like just wrapping up it all together. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just start with the intro, the theory part of it. We are going to just go over references, benchmarks, and the work plan. So the first slide is just kind of like a breakdown and some of the images that I analyzed as I was coming up with kind of like a workflow of how to deal with debris and damage. And with this, I was just looking at three major things, and that is the major art rule that is always a big, medium, and small, and the variation as well as distribution. And kind of like just from the analysis of most of these images, you can see the kind of like how debris is naturally occurs, so to speak, is that you kind of have these huge boulders and medium stuff and small stuff, kind of like it's a recurring thing. You can see the same in this one. And so that was kind of like the first part of it. And as far as distribution goes, this is more of just analyzing how the larger, let me call them the larger rubble and the debris and destruction is scattered. You can see most of it is kind of like concentrated at the center, and as you fan out, you have the smaller debris and smaller rocks and rubbles. Same thing happens here as well, with just a tiny bit variation. Get a mixture of both in the large stuff and also the small stuff, and as you fan out as well, still get the smaller variation, smaller debris and rubble. And these two are a bit different in the sense that the distribution is kind of like from the source, and this is pretty important because, as you can see here, there's a lot of clustering, and this is something that we'll also mention in a few minutes. The clustering is important because, as you can see, the debris only comes up where close to its source, and the same thing happens right here. You can see the debris is only mostly kind of like concentrated around the source or the source of damage, let me call it that way. And same thing happens here, and this one as well. I feel like this is a much stronger example. We move on to the next. These two kind of go over what distribution is and clustering as much as the example dwells on foliage. This is important because, as you can see, this is artwork by Martin Hoff, the abandoned shopping mall, and one of the things that he did quite well is the clustering, in the sense that all the foliage is concentrated or just kind of like appears in small islands, which really helps when you are doing these kind of things, be it foliage or destruction. Clustering helps stuff not to feel too noisy. As much as we are trying to detail our scenes, too much detail also becomes too much noise, and the final image becomes too noisy and not as readable. So yeah, I think that is kind of like the idea behind this. You can see most of the foliage is just clustered together. Yeah, it's the same thing clustered together, and you can also see there's a continuity from maybe like a source, and you can see the foliage kind of like falls down and is a continuous movement. So there's also something important and something that I considered when I was coming up with the destruction and debris stuff. The idea of clustering and also creating some kind of a flow that your eye can follow. This being a very good example, as you can see the foliage starting from a from a very high point, and as it goes down we create this small island and it flows, and as you can see there are no patchy spots of foliage. It mostly just kind of like in small islands, which yeah, kind of helps a lot in creating a believable destruction, kind of like a blend. The same thing is probably just a more clear image. You can see the small islands as well. Same thing happens with the props, as we'll also mention later on. Everything is in clusters. Yeah, and a bit more on this as well. This is work by Sid Baldwin. Was on Demon Souls. You can also see the same exact thing. You can see there is tons of clustering, and the damage only occurs, or you can see the rubble kits and all that in very specific areas, obviously where you have damage, but as well it's not scattered all over, and it's mostly just in small clusters, and yeah, this helps the image read a lot better, and you do not end up with a very noisy scene or a very noisy image. So yeah, as we kind of like move on. Yeah, so given that we have kind of like gone over things that I'd consider are quite important as you are creating your kits or destruction, is the big, medium, small kind of analogy to pick up on. So if we were to assume that these random spheres are our, let me say, destruction kit or whatever it may be, rocks, rubbles, or whatever it is, there is the element of being able to create a rubble that also reads well to the eye. And as we also saw in the very first kind of like slides and reference images, there's this whole pattern where you have kind of like shapes that create, let me call it a small mountain as of sorts. So this is just trying to also kind of like practice the theory that we have gone over thus far. And yeah, so this is kind of like a simple example of what to expect going forward, is how to kind of like create your kit in a way that it reads well and not just a random destruction or rubble kit that might end up being too noisy when it's in your scene and it does not blend so well with everything else. And yeah, so the idea here is as well to have 3 different kits. One that is, so to speak, flat in a way. It does not lean onto anything and it's basically just on flat ground. The second one is more of a kit that is, let's say, a rubble or rocks falling on a wall, and you have a good portion of it just leaning over the wall and others on the ground. And the third one is kit that is probably just going to be placed at a corner somewhere in a room or whichever part of your environment, but having this, at least 3 of this, is usually enough to kind of like set you up to be able to blend mostly every scenario that might come up in your scene that you need to blend in destruction, or yeah, just add in a bit of destruction and debris. Yeah, as we also move on to the next. So this part is mostly going to be a mix of both, a bit of theory stuff and also practical, as I try and go over how I approach my process of creating kits and yeah, what I consider while I create them. Okay, so the first type of kit essentially is just a Rubble kit, and what this is just basic geo, and as you can see, it's just a ton of just rocks and random rocks, destruction stuff, and kind of like also leaning onto what we just went over, kind of like having something that reads well or has a readable shape in a sense. And as we have the bigger rocks and bigger rubble at the very center, and as you fan out, you have some of the smaller stuff just to kind of like blend it out a lot better. And same thing happens here. And yeah, so the benefit, or at least the use case of a Rubble kit is usually just generic damage and kind of like just trying to bring out the overall sense of damage and destruction. And it's usually just generic in a sense, just because it usually fits quite well almost in every single, in most places where there is damage, you can easily bring it in, and it really just completes the destruction. And yeah, the next is the Mound kits. This is a lot similar to what we had with the previous Rubble kits, but what happens with the Mound kit is that you have an additional, let me call it, ground mesh, and this usually helps a lot when you are blending stuff in specific areas and you want your damage to not feel too out of place as like what we had with the first Rubble kit, but this helps to blend it a lot better with the ground with just the addition of like the ground mesh. And the other kit is the blend geometry and scat meshes, and I feel like these two, as we'll go over later on, you'll realize that these two are quite versatile, and the fact that you can use them in any point of your scene, just given their shapes, and they will bring out that sense of blending geometry and blending the destruction quite well. So that is mostly it for the kits that we are going to go over. So let me go over to the next. It's kind of like just a breakdown of my process. So for the Rubble kits, there's more than just one way of creating the Rubble kits, be it Houdini with the physics simulations, and Blender or Cinema 4D. There's so many options, but I'll go over the Unreal Engine 5 physics system and also do a kind of like a brief introduction to what scriptable tools are and how to use them to create Rubble kits. And there's a good reason why I choose to create my Rubble kits in Unreal, and that's because there's a real-time physics system and you can interact with the mesh and move things around and kind of like place things as you want them to be, rather than depending on the simulation to do everything for you and just take whatever result that you get. So that is probably why I choose to do all my physics Rubble, and all that stuff in Unreal. Plus I'm keeping everything in Unreal to avoid the back and forth between whichever DCC I'm using and moving back to Unreal, changing stuff, moving back and forth. So it's usually a lot easier for me creating my kits and Rubble kits in Unreal, using their physics system. So I will go over that, and the kind of like the importance of having, I want to say, an artistic touch or artistic voice to how your kits are made, the Rubble kits, instead of just depending on the simulation to do everything and take whatever result that you get. For the Mound kits, I'm going to be using Blender, but whatever process I'm going to show you guys is, you can literally do it in any other DCC software. It's just basic modeling and scattering assets on a plane. And later on, I'll also show you guys how to create the same using a Zbrush, which might be a slightly different workflow, but the core of it is really the same. And finally, it's the blend geometry and scats. that is all going to be in Blender, or like I said, any other DC software is perfectly fine because it's just basic modeling. Yeah, so I'll just switch over to Unreal. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so just a brief overview of what is to happen. So like I mentioned, all these Rubble kits were made in Unreal, and I'll try and go over my process or how I went over creating them. So I will, like I also mentioned, I'll do a brief kind of like overview of the scriptable tools, and but I'll also, towards the end, I'll also leave a link. You guys can watch a proper video that can take you through the process if you are new to what scriptable tools are. Yep, so yeah, so the first thing is usually just coming down over it's kind of like a mod in itself, so scriptable tools, and yeah, let me see, just a minute. Yeah, there we go. And to be able to access the tool itself, you have to be in simulation mode, and yeah, then clicking onto the tool that you want to use, and this is just where you kind of like drop all the meshes that you want to use for the destruction and everything else, with a few tickable stuff like mesh scale and how far off to offset the drop point. So I'll just pick a few of the Rubble stuff that I had. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Drop them onto that and back to our viewport. Yeah, so essentially it's as easy as just dropping. It's a random selection, selects any, like just a random mesh, and you quickly get a Rubble that is probably to your liking. And yeah, so I feel like this is enough to kind of like show you why I prefer this. It's just because of how fast it is and the fact that you are still keeping everything in engine without moving outside to another software or some of the sort. So while we are still in simulation mode, we can like just tap onto any block and we can still move it around and kind of like push things how we want them to be placed. If we want a specific distribution of the Rubble, we can always do that, since it's just a click and drag thing. And yeah, so that is basically it with the scattering tool. But and once you are done making your Rubble kit, it's always just a matter of selecting all the meshes, and yeah, sometimes it's going to actor and merge actors, and yeah, you can just select whether you want it to, like, you have as many options whether you want it to be a batch or so that is kind of like the simple overview of how to kind of like navigate using the tool and also using Unreal's physics system. So the next part, I'll just try and recreate something that's a lot closer to this. This, as you can see, is kind of like a corner Rubble kit that was supposed to be placed somewhere in a corner. So I'll just quickly try and replicate the same, just to show you guys how I go over the process of creating that. Okay, so the first thing is just getting kind of like a box or a mesh. Let me just this actor. Yeah. Okay. so back to modeling mode, and yeah, try select the faces that we need to remove first. Yeah, we remove the faces and accept. Just above the ground, and yeah. Just to edit the collision, just do a quick edit to yeah, so with this, we are just going to go back into our tool and select it, but start simulation mode first and select our tool, get the rubble pieces or the rock pieces that we want to use for the simulation. And yeah. So drop them in. Yeah. Okay, so kind of like just the same thing. Oh, sorry. We scale this up a bit to get proper scale. Okay. So we are just going to go back into tool and run the simulation mode and select the tool that we want to use. Once again, drop in the rock pieces that we have, and we can just scatter them as kind of like as a random rubble. And yeah, see how. And with that, I feel like those should be enough. And yeah, you can just come back into and complete using the tool. And now we can do a bit more of kind of like dropping stuff where we want it to be and creating kind of like a rubble kit that reads a bit better. And yeah. And the smaller stuff that feels like it would be leaning onto a wall. Yeah, and yeah, and since we already have most of the large parts of the rubble kit that we need, just going to move on to kind of like smaller parts of the rubble itself, just to create kind of like a similar effect where we also have the larger stuff, we have the larger parts of the kit as well as the smaller parts, and yeah, just the tinier parts of the damage itself, so that it kind of like fans out well, and we have something that looks a bit more cohesive and looks like kind of like a larger part of the kit. Okay, yeah. Going to switch back into scriptable tools and select that, and this time I'm just going to pick smaller pieces that I have, like smaller rubble pieces and smaller damage pieces. So just pick a few of them and yeah, drop them into that, and like scale up a bit. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm mostly just scattering bits of it in kind of like the larger pieces and having some of them also move out a bit just to create the same effect where you have some of the smaller bits and pieces kind of like falling out and flaring out in a way. So yeah. And once I am done with that, I feel like we do have the large and small. Now we're just trying to look for the medium stuff, the medium part of the kit. So I'm going to pick a few others that are medium sized, and yeah. Okay, let me select the tool again and switch that 2.5, and yeah, so now we are getting the medium part of the kit itself, like the medium rocks and chunk pieces that kind of like chipping off from the rubble itself. Yeah, that seems good enough, and yeah, I can start to push some of them around and try and see how to better make them fit, and yeah. Getting some of the smaller pieces and bring them a bit more outside to kind of also create the same kind of like flaring out effect where you have from the big stuff and kind of like a slopes down and out to from the larger stuff to the smaller pieces, and yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a quick enough result, and I hope that kind of like gives you guys a good idea of how to use the scriptable tools. But you can always just do the same even without the scriptable tools. It's just a lot easier, and probably just go over that briefly. But yeah, once I'm done, I'll just select all the pieces that we've just added in, and once I've selected them, back into actors, should be here, yeah, and merge them, convert actors to static mesh, and yeah, I'll just name it yeah, and should be somewhere here. Try it again. Chapters. Yeah, let me switch to this other. Yeah, and we can also just turn that off and bring in our rubble, and yeah, that's the complete rubble from that, and yeah, that is it. So like you can always just spend a bit more time into kind of like trying to make it look better than probably I have, but that is basically how I went. That's a process that I went through trying to, or creating all the rest of the Rubble kits that you can see here. So yeah, like I said, most of these were just enough for what I needed for the scene. I had a flat kind of like Rubble, I had one that is a bit more of a corner, and I had some of these that were more flat, and we'll also kind of like go over the mounds as well. So yeah, and like I said, let me just also switch over to the, yeah, and for this part of the, so you don't always need the scriptable tools to be able to create Rubbles or Rubble kits. You can always just drag in piece and have it with simulate physics on. Yeah, simulate physics on, and as you play, you can always just place stuff as you want. But yeah, it seems like this does not have a collision onto it, but yeah, that is mostly just the process. Just bring in whatever pieces that you want to use and take simulate physics, and once you play this, you can see that you can move them around as you wish and place them however you wish. But yeah, that's basically it. Might be a lot easier than the scriptable tools, but yeah, this kind of like offers you, using scriptable tools offers you a lot more options, and it's a lot faster. So yeah, so moving on to kind of like the next, which is yeah, let me just stop this. And yeah, so I feel like the Rubble kits have kind of like went over a significant portion of it, and I do hope that you guys got the gist of it. So yeah, we are just going to move on to the next part, which is the Mound kits. And for this, I'm going to switch over to Zbrush first to show you guys the Zbrush workflow, and then move on to Blender, and I'll show you guys the other workflow. So yeah, so I'll just start off with this. These are, let me see. Yeah, so these are some sculpts that I did for the yeah, these are just some sculpts that I did for the environment. And so my process for this was, what you usually want with a mound is just kind of like, let me just move back to this just to show you guys what I'm, yeah, so essentially what you usually want with a mound is just something a lot similar to this. And as you can see, it's just kind of like a shape that it's kind of like a squashed semicircle, sorry, a squashed sphere, and you scatter the rubble stuff, the rubble and damage stuff all over the mound itself, and that is kind of like basically it. And that is a shape that we are trying to achieve in ZBrush. So the first thing that we'll do in ZBrush is start over into a new Cube 3D, and I will squash this down and to have a surface that we can start working on and kind of like limits. And yeah, let's add in a sphere. Yeah, and from this sphere, just want to subdivide it a bit just to get a bit of resolution to work with. And step in that again. Somewhere here, yeah, polysphere. And yeah, okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, so we are going to subdivide that and apply the subdivision, delete lower. And yeah, so we can just basically start sculpting, and what we are trying to look for is just a general shape that almost feels like yeah, squashed sphere. So that is what I'm going to do first, and kind of like just squash it down. Yeah, down like that, just a bit, just to create kind of like a bulge, yeah, bulging kind of shape, and take any brush. Let me start with the clay brush, and yeah. So sorry. Yeah, so essentially I'm just going over creating some undulation and like just creating a shape that will resemble just a random mound or yeah, a pile of dirt, something of the sorts, just going over it. And yeah, I'm just going to do kind of like a rough thing. Like I said, you can spend as much time as you'd like, kind of like trying to perfect the shape that you have, but just going over it briefly and yeah, just creating a shape that feels organic. Yeah. Sorry, let me switch back. And yeah, so we're just trying to create something that feels organic. And yeah, that should be. Yeah, so so the next thing will be just to start to scatter the rubble pieces, the rock pieces and rubble that we have. And there are kind of like a few ways that you can go about that, but how I tend to approach this is using the insert brushes. Let me just go over that as well. Going to switch back to this where we have the kit that we sculpted. And yeah, so the first thing that you usually want to do is select one of the pieces that you have and scroll all the way down, and you will see an option, create insert mesh brush. So just going to click it and you're going to say new, and going to create a insert mesh brush. And just to toggle that, let me see. And that's the first one. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, that's better. And move back to our insert mesh brush. And to create insert mesh, and let's just say new. Yeah, okay, that's working. So this is our insert mesh brush, and once we select the next piece we want, or the next sculpt piece that we have, just go back in and create insert mesh and just say append, and that just adds onto your brush. And you can already see that you have the first two pieces. So just do the same exact thing, go back into your brush and select create insert mesh and append. Yeah. So you already have kind of like your brushes ready to kind of like scatter on top of the mound that we created. So I'll just switch back to the mound that we were sculpting. And so since I already had the brush set up, I'll just switch over to that so that it's a bit easier. So these are all the sculpts that I had, and I can just click on whichever rock piece that I want and just do that. And it takes a bit of editing and kind of like moving things around, but just placing stuff where you feel like it's right. And take another piece. Another piece, and like place it that way. Be a larger piece as well. Take a larger piece. Let me do that again. And flip it over and kind of like jam it in there. And let's look for kind of like a bigger piece as well. That, and there we go, and sink it into the mound. And so take another smaller chunk and kind of like place it just next to this one. And also take some smaller pieces as well, somewhere here, and yeah. So yeah, you can just kind of like create an insert mesh brush that has all your sculpt pieces that you want to create your mount with. So just go over that and take another piece and kind of like just scattering them around or just on top of your mount and create that. Let's take probably just another piece as well. Jam it in and yeah, so I'll just go over the idea or kind of like the basic idea that you need to kind of like create the same. Let me just do that and take probably a larger piece. Yeah. Yeah, so that is, let's just assume that that's our mount, and we can just go back to our brush and try and sculpt things to kind of like conform a lot better to, kind of conform a lot better to the mesh that we have, but to groups and yeah, so we're just trying to kind of like pull the mount or the dirt that we have to conform a bit better to our rocks, and move the brush intensity a bit more just to get a more subtle effect. But yeah, just trying to conform the mount to feel like, yeah, the rocks are actually kind of like sunken into the dirt or mound or whatever it is that are trying to put together. So yeah, like that. And yeah, so once that is finally done, you now have your mount piece, and happens is that you only need the top piece, and so we also needed kind of like the cube to kind of like single out and just select the top part of the mesh itself. So you can just push it a bit more and kind of like try and add some smaller detail into it. But yeah, the point is just to kind of like get a shape that feels right and feels like a mount. And yeah, once you are done with that, you can just, let's remove masking and take the brush. Yeah, and we should have the kit itself. And can remove the lower half of the mesh, and yeah. Just go down to masking and create mask from the poly groups. Let me see. Mask, yeah. And yeah, we can now select that part alone, or see. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that works. And okay. Yeah, works. And go back into geometry, modify the topology and delete hidden. And yeah, so now you kind of have your Mound mesh to work with now. And from this is essentially going to work as your high poly, and you're going to just bake down from the details onto a low poly. And that is kind of like what I'll go over next, just briefly get the idea of that. So yeah, essentially you can just start off with directly with the Z remesher, and you can also just come here and deal with decimation master, but just to make sure that most of our details not being lost into the, let's say, the parts that are not as important to us. So we are just going to go over onto Z remesher, and yeah, let's create a duplicate of this before we, yeah, okay. Go into Z remesher, and we can just say kind of like, yeah, half should be good enough. And as that processes, and I think it's going to take a while, but that is essentially the workflow. So the next thing that we are just going to do is create the low poly. And once we have our low poly, we're just going to bake down the details from the high poly, and essentially just texture the Mound as a unique asset in itself. So yeah, let me just process it just down a bit. And okay, as that process, let me just go on to the next. Like, this is going to take a bit of time, but essentially the idea is just to create a low poly from your high poly, and you can also just do it as the basic, as you can also just re-topologize it in whatever DCC software that you use. And once you're done, you only just need to bake down the details from the high poly to the low poly bit in Painter or Marmoset, and texture the Mound kit as a unique asset on its own. And yeah, as that runs, let me just move on to the next one, which is the Blender version or the DCC software that you have. So yeah, let me just switch over to Blender. Yeah, okay. So let me switch some of this off first. Okay, so the idea with this is basically just the same thing that we were doing in Zbrush. So start off with a plane of, let me back into this, and okay, it's running. Yeah, so we start off with a plane and or a cube, and we just sculpt around the cube just to get kind of like a shape that we want. And like every Maya or Blender, they both have kind of like sculpting tools in as part of their modeling tools. So it's basically just the same thing, kind of like going over the plane and trying to get a shape that resembles a mound. And yeah, and with this is a bit different just because I was using the example that I showed earlier on, where you have kind of like a wall or a mound that you'd want to kind of like blend into a wall. So that is essentially what I was doing here, and kind of like trying to get a shape that works. And yeah, so that's basically it. Once you get kind of like a good shape that works and you are happy with it, you just move on to kind of like the next step as we did in Zbrush, but this time I am working with the low polys that I took from Zbrush after I baked down my high poly onto low polys. These are just the same assets that we were using in Unreal. This is my low poly mesh, as you can see, like yeah, it's the low poly mesh. So essentially I was just doing the same thing, picking up one, duplicating it over, and yeah, kind of like placing it wherever I feel like is right. And yeah, so that is kind of like the idea. Yeah, placing it somewhere like that, and maybe this other one, and duplicating it, bringing it somewhere closer up, and maybe rotate it a bit. Bring it closer maybe to the center so that we kind of have the bigger pieces at the center, and then fan out with the smaller pieces, and maybe take a few smaller ones as well and bring them forward. Yeah, and yeah, that should basically be it. But that's basically just the idea of creating this. So instead of creating the low poly directly in Zbrush, because what that means is that we are just going to bake it down as an entirely new asset, and obviously that means that that's kind of like texture count, because you do need the 3 texture sets to kind of like, yeah, the base color, AO, and ARM map, and the normal map. So I feel like the benefit of this is just the fact that you are not introducing any new textures or any new maps. So it's, at the end of the day, it's kind of a bit more efficient, just because yeah, you are just reusing assets as they are. So you're not creating any new texture, just bring it in and it works. So probably one additional step will be to take this and take it into Painter and kind of like do more of a transition, because this might be a bit too harsh, especially close up. So usually do is just take the same mesh into Painter and kind of like just do another pass that kind of like adding a bit of that onto the rock itself. The rock's just based off of proximity, and yeah, kind of like just to blend in the rock and not make it have a harsh transition. And this can also be done using maybe vertex paint. And yeah, if you are to kind of like some procedural stuff, or even just painting out a vertex map from be it Blender, be it Maya, or even in Unreal, you can still do that. Paint out a bit of vertex color onto the edges, and yeah, use that mask to add in a bit of transition, let me call it a transition, onto the rock, so that you do not have such a harsh transition, especially yeah in engine. So yeah, that is kind of like the steps that you go over, especially kind of like when you're doing it in any DCC software, as opposed to what we were doing in ZBrush. So let me see if yeah, this should be done, and we can kind of like go over the okay, yeah, should have been done by now. Yeah, okay, so yeah, we can start to yeah. So essentially the point is just to create a low poly from a high poly, and just doing it in steps, so that this mostly avoid having some of the weird geometry that's hidden inside. I would say hidden inside the mesh, and you have to do a lot of cleanup. So doing a progressive decimate makes your work easier in the end, because yeah, you usually don't have as many errors and tons of hidden geo and kind of like yeah, weird geo inside your mesh. So this, and the next step is kind of like going to soften we get the smooth brush first, and Okay, so we're just trying to smooth this out so that we do not end up with too much geo, and we're still going to bake it down and also fill up any kind of like holes that exist. Let me just pick the planar brush, and we can fill up that and just close any hole so that we are not wasting our geo or any geometry going to parts that should essentially just be baked down and not depend on geo. And yeah, just the cracks and small crevices that we have, just fill it up with that, and this, soften it a bit. Yeah, just soften that and soften this as well, and fill any gaps that we have, like here. Let's just soften this as well. So you kind of like just go all over the assets. If you have any cracks or kind of like holes in your sculpts, you just go over them and soften them out or just fill them in so that we are not wasting geo trying to fill out stuff that should essentially be baked down. So like doing the same over here, and yeah. So the next step, let's just do this, and so that we can close the holes that exist, and Dynamesh. Yeah, so that closes out the holes, and we do not have geometry that's within. And kind of like just go over the same thing once again, pre-process current and decimate, pre-process and decimate, pre-process and decimate. So that is like good enough, or yeah, can probably just drop it down a bit more. Okay, let's pre-process current. To 40%. Yeah, that might be a bit too much. Maybe let's just do 80. Process, and last time. Yeah, that should be good enough. So with that, this is essentially our low poly, and like we may not unwrap it at the moment, so I'll just do a quick UV unwrap from the UV master. Yeah, so we do have UVs, and so this is now our high poly, and the next thing we need is just need to create some groups for that. And so essentially you just want kind of like a random vertex color so that we can also be able to pick out our rocks versus the mound when we are texturing in Painter. So this, we're just going to enable the colors and export it. So groups to paint. Yeah, go and export that out. So maybe it's an FBX. Put this sphere one. So as that is exporting out, just going to also just move on to the next part of the so I feel like we have gone over the creation process of the mounds, and the next few steps are just going to be showing how to create the next piece, which is the blend mesh or blend geometry, and that should be it. So let me just go back into Blender and let me remove that. So essentially the blend mesh is just kind of like a squashed sphere that has some noise on top or undulation. So that's mostly just what you need for blend mesh, and we are just going to go over the same in Engine, and you're going to see how this works and why the shape itself is quite useful and versatile, because we can use it to blend so many parts of the destruction and bring things together. Yeah, so back to this. Yeah. So now we can export the low poly as well, and yeah. Yeah, so I'm just going to get to the baking part, and the rest is kind of like just like how you texture a normal asset or kind of like a unique asset in Painter. Go over the baking process and do the full. So yeah, let's just wait for Painter to start up, and can just do a quick bake and leave it at that. And yeah. Select. Sphere should be. And go back in and take our high poly as well. Just going to do a quick bake, so maybe a 2K should be enough, and just to like show you the process. So we have that, just change the ID to vertex color, and yeah. And yeah, we have our final piece, and you can just come in and probably just texture it as you just grab a smart material that I was using for this. Select all our rocks, and yeah, so like once you have all your rocks kind of like textured and ready to go, it's just a matter of texturing the mound with whichever texture sets that you have ready, and yeah, just doing the transition that we talked about earlier on, doing kind of like a fade that transitions whichever color is on your ground. Let me just quickly go over that and pick a random color. Yeah. Black mask, and invert, yeah. So once you have that, you can always just go in and like just paint over and do the same. Let me just add a paint layer on top as well. And yeah, just kind of like blending in the rocks with the ground so that it does not seem like a harsh transition. And like just going over that with the same color or material that you're using on the ground. And yeah, so that is like basically the process of starting with the high poly in Zbrush and creating your low poly and getting your mound. Yeah, so obviously you can take a lot more time to trying to put this together and getting a decent result, but that is as much as the process goes. So yeah, you can always spend a lot more time doing some unique texturing and trying to push the asset to look as realistic as it can or to your desired level. So yeah, that is that. And finally, as we were kind of like talking about the mound, yeah, it's just as simple as this. And as we are going to go over the demo, I'll show you guys how easy this is to use, and like you can actually get so much out of just this one blend mesh alone. So yeah, let's go over to the next part of it, which is, yeah, we already went over creating textures and the blend kits and all that. And yeah, the next is just a big question, or just something that was brought up, is the question of geometry versus textures for detailing. And as we are going to see later on, it's geometry works a lot better for large to medium scale debris pieces and yeah, large detailed pieces, but textures also come in where you need a small scale detail. Let's say like it's tiny tiny river stones and such stuff. It makes a lot more sense to use a texture for that as opposed to geometry, because you are essentially wasting geo, because that is geometry that could have been used probably to make your hero prop look a lot better. So yeah, when the detail that you're trying to bring into your scene is very small, or it doesn't make sense to use that as geometry unless the situations call for it. And yeah, and like we also talked about creating transitions, and this is kind of like an extract from Shadow of the Tomb Raider game, and you can see how they are using textures to blend between two surfaces. You can see this is kind of like a clean ground and this is a rocky surface, and they are using a rocky texture to blend in between the two, the rocky surface and the clean ground. So kind of like just transitions from rock and blends into the clean ground that is not as rocky. And yeah, we're also going to go over that in the second demo part of the session. Yeah, another kind of like a question that was also brought up is runtime virtual textures versus scat meshes. And for anyone who's not aware of what runtime virtual textures are, it's a kind of like a feature that is native to Unreal and used a lot to blend surfaces, especially because it kind of like stores height data from a landscape, and you can use that data to blend into kind of like if it's a rock that's blending into a ground surface. So that's where kind of like runtime virtual textures shine. And yeah, I do have a few. I personally prefer scat meshes just because of performance issues, just because the runtime virtual texture is a bit performance intensive because it does query a lot from the GPU. So scats will always be cheaper than using runtime virtual textures, and scats will always have more than one use case. You can use it to blend not just rock pieces, you can just use it to also blend architecture together. So a scat will always, most times, will outweigh the benefits that come with runtime virtual textures. Plus also runtime virtual textures are not available in, or the feature is not available in some game engines. So that might also be a problem when you are trying to work with a game engine that does not have a feature that kind of matches what the runtime virtual texture does. So yeah, I guess if there are questions over that, I would want to go to kind of like the next session. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just asking whether there are any questions up until that point, or I want to kind of like move into the demo session.
Let me see. We had one question for the ZBrush part.
Yeah.
I think this is like a more general question, right? Mm-hmm. Which brushes are you are your go-to for rocks?
It's the, let me switch to ZBrush. It's usually this two. It's a trim smooth border and planar brush. Trim smooth border with square alpha. And there is also the planar brush that we were using. Yeah, also with square alpha. And the last one is kind of like it's a clay tubes brush, but with square alpha as well. So this mostly just to do soft damage and yeah, that kind of thing.
All right. That's all there was for this point.
Okay.
So you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the next part of this is just the demo. So we're just going to go over the Unreal scene, and I'm just going to show you guys how I used kind of like the kits and how I use them to blend the damage all together. So yeah. Sorry, let me split this. Yeah, so I'll start with the Rubble kits themselves. So most of the kits that I was using were just some of the flat kind of like rock rubbles that I had in my kit. So you can see here, most of the damage is kind of like clustered together as a rubble piece. You can see this is one entire piece, and just to show the destruction at this point, and just a bit more to kind of like bring everything together. And like we mentioned earlier on, the importance of clustering together your damage is the fact that it becomes quite readable and your scene becomes not too noisy, and that is the case in this. At least I was trying to kind of like put together all the damage and rubble mounds and all that all together into kind of like clustering them together into one space or just one area, so that you do not have everything scattered everywhere in the name of detailing, and that only ends up feeling too noisy and yeah, doesn't always read so well. So yeah, these are the first kind of like the kit that we went over first. The Rubble kit, this as well is just a Rubble kit as well, and we also have kind of like this, and this is what we mentioned earlier on. This is more of a Mound kit. So you can see the blend of this works a lot better than what you have with just a basic rubble that doesn't have kind of like a flooring piece that comes with it as well. Yeah, that comes with it. So it's a bit easier to blend in stuff when you have this kind of like a Mound piece, and the use case is somewhere here. This is the kit that we saw earlier on that is a kind of like tailored to fit into kind of like a wall, and yeah, you can see that as well. And also just going over what I mentioned earlier on with the blend mesh itself and how versatile it can be. This whole area is just being used by, we're just using this blend mesh to kind of like blend in the damage to the ground, and same is also being used here. So yeah, kind of like 50 to probably 60% of the scene is just this blend mesh that is doing a lot of the heavy lifting and doing a lot of the heavy lifting and blending. So apart from the smaller pieces that we have, this is also part of the Rubble pile that we had, just a few scattered rocks that kind of help to create a bit of detail and just show the kind of like transition from from kind of like larger pieces to smaller pieces. And this is also still the blend kit itself. It just rotated to kind of like fit in well, and also trying to create kind of like the effect where you have that accumulation and build up in stair steps, and kind of like in stair steps, the same thing, still a blend mesh. Just place it in, and it's rotated just so that it looks like it perfectly fits into that. And same thing with this, still a blend kit. And the rest is just the Rubble piles once again. And this is a much larger piece, and but it's essentially just the same kit and put together into a group. So blends it all together. So most of this is just how I used the blend kits to create the damage. And as we talked about earlier on, what I was also trying to do also from this, kind of like creating choosing one camera angle and trying to think of the damage in groups and clustering together. Like this whole part reads as one large group of damage, as well this also reads as one whole group of damage. And so that's kind of like the idea when you are trying to scatter your debris and destruction assets and kits, is usually want to kind of like have it clustering together so that it does not become too visually noisy and becomes a bit too jarring to the eye. And part of this was also kind of like thinking about gameplay, and if a player were to walk into this scene, you want them to have a clear passage and something that is straightforward. And yes, this is the area of visual rest, so it easily creates kind of like a path that a player easily relates to, that we are going forward. So those are some of the things that I was thinking about when I was scattering the debris pieces and all that. And the rest are just kind of like the same idea, just clustering, even with larger pieces, clustering stuff and making sure that the detail is not too much, because it gets to a point where detailing starts to feel like noise, and that is obviously not the goal. So that is mostly it. The rest of the kits that we saw earlier on I used somewhere in here, and you can see there's just one kit in itself, and this was specifically made for kind of like a stair part. So using just the same physics system from Unreal and scattering some assets so that they fit well enough. And this is also the corner piece that we saw earlier on, and how it fits into kind of like the wall. And this is once again kind of like the blend kits, and I was saying they are really versatile because you can actually use them anywhere, and if you rotate them well enough, you can create a nice feeling that the architecture is not plain and things kind of like exist in the same environment and they blend in together. So this is also another Mound piece that is just on its own. And I'll also kind of also briefly go over something that you need to consider while making the mounds and blend kits is the blend itself. As you can see, the mesh kind of like disappears as it comes into contact with whichever geometry is close enough to it, and that is kind of like a shader setup that I'll bring up in a moment. So let me just up my shader. Yeah, so this is essentially the part that takes care of that, creating the smooth transition between the geometry part of the where the blend meets any other geometry or asset or mesh. So this is what does that. It's basically just dither temporal and hooked up into the pixel depth offset. So yeah, these are just some controllable parameters, the random value, and yeah, the amount as well, which is just a multiplier. Yeah, so I don't know whether up to that point there are any questions, or probably anyone with yeah. I saw a question somewhere here.
Yeah, I think Aria was asking actually exactly about the thing you were just showing off right now.
Yeah.
That was like her second question.
Okay, yeah, I can see.
And I think as to her first question, you'll probably also be showing a couple of resources at the end of.
Oh yeah, the scriptable tools.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a link that I'll leave towards the end, and yeah, but I can also just show the setup that I have, and maybe you can take a screenshot and yeah, just open that up. Let me this. Yeah, so this is the setup. I know how be able to. Let me try and increase this space a bit. Whether there's a better way to show this off, but it's basically this. I feel like the tutorial that I'll show you guys at the end, or leave a YouTube link, has most of this covered. The only difference that my kind of like a system has is just this being able to set up an array of meshes that you want to scatter. So I feel like this up to this part, up to this point, the tutorial does that. And so yeah, this is probably just the part that you need to maybe just check out, kind of like, yes, set static mesh, and this part, create an array that picks out a random mesh every time you scatter a particular piece. So yeah, this is probably just the only part that is not included in the tutorial. So yeah, if you are watching, can just take a screenshot and yeah. Okay, let me see if there's any other question. But so yeah, I believe there aren't any other questions, so I'll should move to the next section. Okay. Yeah, so the second part is just a demo, the second demo that we are going to go over, just to show the texture blending and how to use textures to blend the debris and kind of like ground it a lot better, which is something that in the previous temple scene I did not do, because the grounding itself was probably good enough, plus I did not want as much rock as we'll be showcasing in a few minutes. So let me just move on to the next part. Yeah, so this is kind of like a smaller diorama of the scene, and just quite kind of like a quick showcase of what we. Let me put this into kind of like a smaller screen so that you guys can see everything. Yeah, so essentially most of this is just vertex painting and blending together individual textures to kind of like create a transition from a rocky surface to a kind of like a more clean surface and a ground that is not as rocky as the rest. So my setup is simple. I have a vertex paint where the rocky part of the texture is controlled by the red channel, and this part is controlled by the green channel, and fades out to the blue or just black. So just kind of like take this and that's so yeah, go back to this and select. Yeah, so with this, increase the brush size a bit. So essentially you can see if this is just the plain ground without the rocky surface, and as I mentioned earlier on, it's better off to use a texture when the detail that you're trying to put onto a mesh is high frequency detail or is just tiny detail stuff. So the point is just trying to create a transition so that we don't have such a harsh transition from the rock surface to the ground surface. So it's kind of like going back in and tapping a bit of it just around some of the areas to create a much cleaner transition, and that is not as harsh. So like just going over some of these areas and adding in this and go into this area and painting out a bit and going over into the next texture so that kind of like also bleed into that and add a bit of rocks that transition out from the kind of like more concentrated pile of rocks. So yeah, that is basically just the idea, creating a transition from the rocky part of the damage or assets and trying to blend it into the ground. So in this case, we're just using another texture to kind of like just add in a few rocks to make the transition a lot cleaner and better. Yeah. Let's go with that as well. Yeah, so hope that kind of like gives you a good idea of how to at least tackle texture blending with as far as kind of like blending together the damaged assets with the ground just to create a clean transition from the geometry to just a texture and a plain ground. So yeah, so I don't know up to that point if there are any questions as far as texture blending goes or texture authoring.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, ask them away.
Yeah.
And I'll pick them up for later, as usual.
Yeah. Okay. So the next part of it is mostly just kind of like a conclusion as I kind of like bring out some parting shots of the entire analogy of blending destruction together. Is first thing that we mentioned early on is detailing versus noise, and just to emphasize on that a bit, this is an earlier version of the scene of the temple, and you can already see that the center or just the destruction itself was becoming too noisy because there was too much detail everywhere, and that did not read so well because there is, even composition wise, things don't read so well because as much as you want whoever the player to come in and look at a specific point, this is already too noisy and there is no distinct path that a player needs to look at, and That's why I'm also kind of insisting on clustering, because that's basically it. When you're clustering your damage together and creating some of these small kind of like islands of damage, you end up with something that does not feel extremely noisy and feels a bit more cohesive. Kind of like just small islands, small neat islands. So that's kind of like the same thing that you need to think about when you are blending in damage and creating debris. Yeah, so apart from that, there is just the same like thing that we talked about, is variation in debris, having big, medium, and small, and having kind of that flare effect where you have the big stuff at the center, or just kind of like at a middle point, and have the medium and small, and a bit of variation. Doesn't have to always be that way, but just creating that kind of like slope so that the assets can also kind of like blend a lot better into the ground. Because if you have kind of like huge kind of like rock piles and you're trying to blend that well enough into the ground, it's just going to feel a bit weird, and it will stand out a lot more than you'd expect if you're just using kind of like that sloping kind of like drape, I want to call it. So yeah. And I did see the question about the links and resources regarding to scriptable tools. This is a video by Render Bucket, and this is the link. You can find it here. And yeah, and the other one is kind of like a talk that was done also still on Beyond Extent by John Ariano. He did talk on modular kits for games environment, and he also mentioned most of these things in most of the things that I've mentioned. He also mentioned the same in his talk. So if I would, because the talk is also on YouTube, I'd strongly suggest that you watch it. He does go over also the same idea of blending organic assets, blending destruction. So yeah, if you are interested in that, I would highly suggest that you watch the talk by John. Yeah, he goes over that as well. So I'm sure there is a lot more to learn from that as well. Yeah. So yeah, as well. So also great thanks to John. He was my mentor on this project. So the much that I'm sharing with you guys, some of the stuff I learned from him. So yeah, guess that's it for me. And maybe there are any questions, or yeah.
Shout out to John as usual.
Yeah.
Great guy.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat between now and what Arya asked. But I do have maybe like one or two questions of my own.
Yeah.
How many unique bricks did you sculpt for this kit? Or like in your opinion, how many unique bricks would you need to create like a realistic rubble pile? Because like I know, for example, like John, when he talked about his organic kits, he was saying like 3 is usually enough. But in my opinion, I think for this kind of kit, you might need a bit more.
I actually used, was it 4, or let me just move back to the, because what I did was just, let me switch back to this. Yeah, I just had 4. These were 1, 2, 3, 4, and usually just need 4 of each, 4 of kind of like a clean brick, or kind of like a clean stone, and then from that you can get another detail level which is maybe slightly damaged, and then another part of it that is completely damaged, and that's what I did with this. But I only needed the clean part of it and the damaged part of it. So this is just an extraction of this. I just took this, split it, and did a bit more sculpting. Same thing with this, split it up and did a bit more sculpting in between. Same thing with this, and the same thing with this as well. So yeah, I really only needed I would say 4, because these were the main main pieces that I used even for the other parts of the architecture. So